Story 1. Macbeth. He killed Duncan in battle, not in his sleep, and by all accounts, he was a decent king of Scotland. The Scottish play was just Shakespeare's way of sucking up to the Stuart dynasty. Story 2. Charles Lightoller was the most senior officer who survived the Titanic disaster. He is mostly remembered for interpreting Captain Smith's order to evacuate as women and children only, leading to the deaths of most of the male passengers. He was even portrayed negatively in the James Cameron film Titanic, with one scene depicting him threatening to shoot the passengers like dogs if they didn't organize themselves, an event that did not actually happen. However, after the disaster, he gave a very honest testimony and did not shy away from accepting blame. He was the one who stood up in court and stated that it was reckless to keep the ship at speed on a calm sea where icebergs would be difficult to see. He later campaigned with the British Board of Trade and other maritime organizations to establish new mandatory regulations, basing lifeboat capacity on the number of passengers and crew instead of ship tonnage, conducting lifeboat drills so passengers know where their lifeboats are and crew know how to operate them, instituting manned 24-hour wireless radio communications on all passenger ships, and requiring mandatory transmissions of ice warnings to ships. These regulations are still followed today. In May 1940, he heard about the evacuation at Dunkirk on the radio and set off in his personal yacht, the Sundowner, saving 127 men. He was a remarkable man. Story 3. Peter Lustig, a popular German children's TV presenter, had his legacy tarnished by Bild, Germany's biggest tabloid paper, because he refused to collaborate with them. They fabricated stories about him, such as claiming he hated children, and spread these falsehoods widely. Although they were sued and forced to issue a clarification, the correction has not reached everyone. Many people still believe the accusations even after his death, and it's a shame Bild ruined his last years and never faced real consequences for it. Story 4. You know that dingo ate my baby woman? Turns out it did. It absolutely did. But we only found that out years after she was internationally ridiculed and convicted of murder. The poor woman and her family. Story 5. Anne Boleyn, and tried to leave the court when King Henry VIII took an interest in her. It was a position her family had worked hard to secure and one she had trained for. Yet she retreated to Hever Castle to escape his interest. Surviving letters from King Henry VIII show that he continued to write to her after she had left, wondering why she was refusing his gifts and not sending responses. He would stay nearby at her cousin's estates and ignore her polite refusals. Eventually, he traveled to Hever with an offer of marriage. She agreed to marry Henry and was reviled for it. Her contemporaries attempted to paint her as a vile, opportunistic seductress who enthralled the king. In reality, she was relentlessly sexually harassed. It's possible she kept those letters to prove she had done nothing wrong. What a lot of people tend to forget is that Anne was deeply pious. It is likely that she learned to accept her fate, as it provided her with the influence to make the kind of reform she believed in, and indeed it's possible that she played a significant role in the Henrician Reformation, and famously became one of the two wives that King Henry VIII executed. A promising new alliance fell apart when Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire refused to ratify their marriage. She also had a falling out with her closest ally at court, Thomas Cromwell. Henry was already smitten with Anne's lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, and most damning of all, Anne had failed to produce a male heir. Historians generally agree that the evidence of Anne's adultery was likely fabricated by Henry as an excuse to be rid of her. They pretty much unanimously agree that the accusation that she had an affair with her own brother is entirely made up, despite it costing George Boleyn his life. He gave an impassioned speech at his execution, stating, "Trust not in the vanity of the world, and especially in the flattering of the court." Henry made sure and had a terrible time locked in the Tower of London, where it's reported she had a restless night before her execution. He left her body lying in the square for some time, as proper burial arrangements had not been made. In his lingering resentment, he tried to erase her from history and court. She became a maligned woman of Tudor history, one who still fascinates popular culture today but only when played as a scheming seductress. She is perhaps one of the longest examples of being shamed through history, a victim of sexual harassment, a pious and devout woman who vowed to be no man's mistress, not even a king's. For the crime of not bearing a male heir, she died and lives on as a media mockery of her true self. Her last laugh is that the undesired girl she gave birth to went on to become one of England's greatest queens, Queen Elizabeth I. Henry brutalized his wives in his obsession for a male heir and became surpassed by a woman instead. I like to think this was a little bit of justice for N. Story 6. Richard Jewell. Not only did he not plant bombs at the Olympics in 1996, he was actually the hero who alerted that there were bombs in the first place. Story 7. Frederick II. He is also known as the spawn of the devil, so obviously people don't think highly of him, but he was actually a pretty decent leader to his people. It's just that either the current pope of that time didn't like him and spread rumors about him, which eventually led to him getting that nickname, or just wanted the land he owned. Story 8. Draco, the author of the first Athenian legal code, is where the word draconian, implying unduly harsh or punitive, derives from. This is due to the historical reputation of his legal code, which basically had death as the sole option for most criminal infractions. At the time he was writing, Athenian society really only had death, exile, or shunning as viable punishments. He was exiled from Athens due to the backlash to the work he was commissioned to perform by the Athenian assembly. Story 9. In the film Titanic, the character Murdoch killed someone, took bribes, and generally came across as a terrible person. He was a real-life person who was actually a hero and saved many lives. His living relatives were so disgusted that the vice president of Fox traveled to Dalbeattie to personally apologize and presented a £5,000 donation to Dalbeattie High School to boost the school's William Murdoch Memorial Prize. Story 10. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line and the antagonist in James Cameron's Titanic, was the gentleman who said that people wanted to marvel at the speed of Titanic and urged Captain Smith to sail faster. In reality, Ismay wouldn't have had much, if any, input to Smith, and if so, Smith likely wouldn't have heeded Ismay's advice, as Smith was nearing retirement and would not have taken advice from a businessman. Alternatively, Ismay knew that he was in capable hands and would never impose upon the captain by telling him how to sail his ship. Survivors testified that during the sinking, Ismay was trying everything he could to assist with the filling of the lifeboats. He convinced passengers to get into boats and at one point had to be told by an officer to stop trying to help as he was getting in the way. Ismay took a vacant seat on one lifeboat just before it was about to be lowered, which was one of many empty spots on that particular lifeboat. Ismay was a scapegoat because he was the highest-ranking survivor of the sinking, and he became a recluse afterward. As another testament to his character, he created several charities aimed at helping families and survivors of maritime incidents. This is the comment of a user named Mighty Casey Struck Out. Great comment. Story 11. Alfred Nobel. People assume he invented dynamite so it could be used as a weapon, and blame him for all the millions of war deaths since, and say it's ironic that he created the Nobel Peace Prize. He was from a family of miners, and his father and elder brother both died in gunpowder accidents, so he wanted to create a safe explosive that wouldn't go off if you accidentally dropped it. He was literally trying to save lives. Story 12. The lady who sued McDonald's when the hot coffee burned her. Her genitals were basically burned off, and the McDonald's coffee melted the cup. Blame the media for the spin that never died. Story 13. Machiavelli is often criticized for The Prince, for essentially endorsing what everyone at the time privately practiced to take advantage of a specific opportunity that arose in Italy. His discourses are far more developed and offer a closer reflection of him, providing context to much of The Prince, such that I would genuinely not recommend reading The Prince without the discourses. Story 14. Nietzsche was a kind, humanistic person who hugged a horse that was being abused and feuded with Wagner over his anti-Semitism. His works were taken out of context by the Nazis and others. Story 15. Marie Antoinette was most likely just an overly sheltered rich woman who was used as a pawn in a political marriage, then ridiculed when asked about topics she had no real knowledge of or power to change. Not saying she was a good person, but we don't know what she would have done if she wasn't sheltered from the suffering of her people, or had married for love instead of familial obligations. Story 16. Napoleon Bonaparte is often viewed as a villain, but some argue he modernized Europe with reforms like the Napoleonic Code, which influenced democratic ideals and legal systems. Story 17. When human immunodeficiency virus first emerged, a team of researchers worked tirelessly, investigating various hotspots across the country. All they knew was that gay men were getting sick and dying, and they wanted to figure it out. They didn't know why, but one suspected cause was poppers, which were popular in the gay community. The working name they used was gay-related immune deficiency. Now, some criticize this in hindsight, suggesting it reflects homophobia and a lack of compassion. However, these researchers were dedicated to understanding why gay men were dying, and that's the recognition they deserve. Story 18. I just think Medusa is often seen as a villain, but her story is one of victimization and injustice, reflecting the consequences of trauma and the complexities of power dynamics. Because of that, the curse turned her into a monster with snakes for hair, causing anyone who looked at her to turn to stone. Story 19. Monica Lewinsky literally broke away from federal agents who were trying to get her on the record against Bill Clinton. She snuck away and tried to call Clinton's secretary Betty Curry. Curry was at lunch and missed the call. The federal agents eventually got a statement from Monica. Clinton did not know, and Clinton lied to the federal agents. Had Monica reached Curry, the world would be a completely different place. Story 20. As an American, I was taught to see King George III as the worst of tyrants, but he actually was a fairly decent monarch and a very interesting person, although he suffered from mental illness. On the other hand, Thomas Jefferson, who I was taught to revere, blurg. Story 21. Courtney Love. There are absolutely a lot of valid reasons to dislike her. I love her music, but some of her actions and the things she says vary from absolutely wild to indefensible. But I don't believe for a second she killed Kurt Cobain or orchestrated it. The amount of hate, just vitriolic misogyny, thrown at her is huge and constant. Their daughter even catches residual hatred from this and has horrible things said about her. Kurt Cobain was a huge feminist, and I think he'd be beyond disgusted at the things being said by people claiming to be Nirvana fans. Also, there's the thing about publicly outing Harvey Weinstein. On the red carpet of the roast of Pamela Anderson, while not in her right mind, Courtney said the best advice she could give to young women in Hollywood was, "I'll get libeled if I say it. If Harvey Weinstein invites you to a private party at the Four Seasons, don't go." It absolutely destroyed her acting career. She was on a lot of drugs at the time, but hey, good advice. Story 22. General George Thomas. A Virginian, he fought for the North in the Civil War. He performed brilliantly and is a hero in the eyes of most Northerners. In the South, he is vilified. Story 23. Captain Bligh. His punishment and discipline is harsh by modern standards but quite mild by contemporary standards, if not lenient. Offenses aboard that he punished with lashes could well have been punishable by death in the late 1700s. Also, he performed one of the greatest feats of navigation in history and, in the process, was able to keep every one of his crew alive by the time they reached East Timor over a month after being put off the Bounty, after navigating over 3,000 miles of the Pacific Ocean by memory. He learned well from his mentor, Captain Cook. Story 24. Machiavelli would be shocked and saddened to know his name is synonymous with tyranny and pure evil. He was a staunch supporter of republics and a savvy politician. Story 25. Antonio Salieri. The movie Amadeus paints Salieri as a jealous composer who hated how much success Mozart had as contemporaries, but the movie really takes some liberties with their relationship. In fact, all accounts say that they had mutual respect for one another, with Salieri even teaching Mozart's son at a young age. Amadeus is a great movie, but it doesn't give enough credit to Salieri's character or his music. Story 26. Captain Hazelwood of the Exxon Valdez did his best to get the ship fixed, but Exxon refused. The crew was exhausted, and when he asked for relief, Exxon refused again. He relieved himself of duty and let the executive officer take over with a green crew. Not uncommon, but not a good idea. Bligh Reef had no markers and the Coast Guard had funding cuts, so there was no monitoring of Valdez. When the event happened, he said, "I need a drink," and the media portrayed him as a wily, drunk sloppy sea captain who steered the ship himself into the reef. He had no alcohol in his blood during and after the event and honestly did the right thing as a mariner. He paid his dues physically and financially, and from people I know who met him, he was actually a good person. Yet he's portrayed as the Adolf Hitler of the environment. It may have been a terrible case, but it was an opportunity to come up with pollution control methods to help contain and clean spills, creating entire industries and laws to help the environment. I also met many people who helped clean up the spill and towed the ship, whom the news demonized. Exxon renamed and sold the ship, and it changed hands a few times before being scrapped in the 2000s. Meanwhile, you have cases like the El Faro incident where the captain didn't try to avoid the hurricane, and the plan was call the office before abandoning ship. I would rather be fired than be at the mercy of some person whose closest experience to a boat is a gravy boat. Then there were the multiple oil rig disasters that caused many lives to be lost and millions of barrels to be spilled into the ocean. But Captain Hazelwood was a drunk pirate,